Welcome to everybody. We are going to start the afternoon sessions. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Andre Goodcook, who is the TInnGO coordinator, for presenting the keynote, our keynote speaker, Eleanor Lisney. Andre, are you there?
Hello, Francis. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the session. I wasn't expecting I would do this introduction, but I am very pleased to introduce Eleanor Lisney, who I've known for several years and who I've been following very much on Facebook and social media. Eleanor is a campaigner, founder member, and public speaker and co-director of Sisters of Freedom. And she's also an Access advisor and co-founder of Cultural Access, and I would be really interested in what she has to say today and her experiences of mobility. So with further ado, I'd like to invite Eleanor to the floor. Thank you.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Ah, I think I need to put the webcam on. Can you see me now?
Yes, yeah, that's fine, Eleanor. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I put my presentation up now? Where do I go to?
We can see your presentation, I think. We've got introduction slide on at the moment and your face on top of it.
Oh, great, thank you. First of all, thank you to Andre for inviting me here. You've introduced me, so I should say I'm a researcher activist. I realized that I might be the only non-academic on this conference. I've been listening. I have lived in Malaysia, the UK, in France, and lived and worked in the USA. I should say that throughout this presentation, I will use the term disabled people rather than people with disabilities, following the social model of disability. In case people here do not know what the social model of disability is, this is from a definition from Inclusion London. The social model of disability was developed by disabled people to identify and take action against disabled people's oppression and exclusion. It was developed as a direct challenge to the prevailing models of disability that viewed disability as an individual medical problem that needed to be prevented, cured, or contained, or as a charitable issue that viewed disabled people as unfortunate who needed to be pitied and catered for by segregated charitable organizations. So, to start, what is inclusive mobility for disabled people? I'm going to have to move because I can't see my own presentation. Ah, here we go. Sorry. What is inclusive mobility for disabled people? For many people, it means access, which is right, physical access. However, there is more to be considered, and definitely there are more barriers. We cannot ignore, to start with, to talk about inclusive mobility for disabled people. We cannot ignore the historical battle for disability rights to accessible transport by disabled people, for rights to accessible transport. And for here, I would say that focus is on the UK. It started with buses. in the 1990s. Disabled people fought for rights to public transport. This is my friend Sue Elsgood. As I said, it started in 1990 when she got a call from a friend asking if she fancied hijacking a bus. Back then, few buses were accessible, if any, and wheelchair users have to give several days notice to travel by train. And even then, they were put in guard's van because of lack of space in the carriages. I wasn't here then. Sue is a very good friend of mine, and she lives in Greenwich, where I am now. And I should say that's the direct action protest run by CAT, the Campaign for Accessible Transport. Now with trains, and this is something I experienced myself. When you travel by trains, if you're a wheelchair user, they put you in the guards van with the bicycles and the trolleys and the mail. So Crippen, Dave Lupton, did this cartoon for that, and you can access the whole article from BBC News. It's called Wheelchair Warriors. So to follow, in the UK, there was the DDA in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act. And that's important for disabled people, even if disabled activists do not agree that it fulfills all their demands. And in 2010, it was replaced by the Equality Act. And then disability became, or disabled people became, one of the protected characteristics. The primary purpose of the Equality Act is consolidating, updating, supplementing the numerous prior acts and regulations, that is the Equal Pay Act 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, the Race Relations Act in 1976, and the DDA in 1995. However, that was some time ago. I can tell you that the struggle still continues for transport. We still do protests, and this photo is by John Pring from the Disability News Service. It's a protest by Transport for All. I wasn't at this particular protest, but I have been at the Transport for All protests at London's train stations. In my title, I said I was going to talk about the intersectionality perspective on inclusive mobility. Disabled people are found in all sectors of society. There are disabled people from birth, and also those who acquire impairments from accidents, for age. I forgot to add illness. For example, I had polio. So yeah, the UK's legal definition of disability might be different from other countries, especially in Europe and in the US. However, I'm looking at the UK. And when it comes to discrimination, there are, of course, intersections when we looked at gender, race, disability, age, nationality, and regional differences, because one size doesn't fit all. And very often, disabled women, disability are not included. And I've noticed that even on speeches made on intersectionality. I sometimes feel obliged to put my hand up because I be the only person mentioning disability in a room full of people all talking about intersectionality. It's not always comfortable. On smart mobility for disabled people, again, we just had the COP26. Disabled people with difficulty, and I'm sure you read in the news that the Israeli woman was not able to access the conference because it wasn't accessible for her to get there. However, there were disabled people who have remarked and said that many of the changes to the habits and lifestyles that could help minimize climate change are very difficult or even impossible for some disabled people to do. And I think when we talk about smart mobility, very often we are talking about the reduction of pollution, the sort of thing we're talking about, to minimize climate change, like fumes, and so that to reduce the carbon footprint, etc. And this is the same for smart mobility for disabled people, because the focus, and I have been listening to people's presentations on this conference, the focus is very often on active travel, such as walking, e-scooters or biking, and pedestrianization of city centers means that disabled, and that includes, I include older women, older people, will be hampered from shopping, leisure, and civil activities. Not everybody is able to use or want to use online shopping. And the pedestrianization includes not being able to park for people with blue badges, or for people who can use accessible parking. They become less and less available. I will talk about the impact on COVID on use of public transport by disabled women later. Just on accessible transport for disabled people, I've just put some photos in here. The first one is, we were in Geneva talking about the UN instruments for us on discrimination. There are 3 wheelchair users. One of them, that's me. Next to me is somebody from Eastern Europe. And then there is patients, I think, from Africa. And the next one is me in front of a plane. And I think I was wondering how I was going to get up, waiting for the bridge to help me to get on that plane. So accessible transport for disabled people, we're talking about trains, planes, and automobiles, and that includes taxis. And for modes of transport, I include wheelchairs. But we also are talking about pedestrian, being pedestrian, so pedestrian areas, shared spaces. Shared spaces is extremely problematic, especially for people who are blind or have impaired vision. We're talking also about signage and here I include mobility vehicles, and that is cars. And I'm talking specifically in terms of disabled people, because in the UK, you can buy a car or a van. It's called mobility, and it helps you from getting A to B. The reason I'm adding that is it's not a private car. It's not. It is for private usage, because a lot of disabled people can't use public transport for all sorts of reasons, and find it easier to have a car or a van, and have them driven, because one of the big barrier is just fear of public transport, and I will talk about that a bit more. And that's also street furniture. I mentioned street furniture because as a wheelchair user, or friends of mine who are visually impaired, now more and more, especially because of COVID, people have put their stuff outdoors. Now, it could be good for some, because I noticed that cafes and restaurants that didn't used to be accessible now, have more tables outside, which means that I can use that restaurant. However, and that is just when the weather permits it, of course. So I just added some more photos on accessible transport. One with the ramp, that is in Hong Kong, on their equivalent of the tube, and it's good. We don't have that here. I am saying that because one of the reasons why wheelchair users do not use the tube is mind the gap, because very often the carriage is much higher than the platform, and you really have to kind of run at it to be able to access. And when you have people in the carriage, it's worrying because you might bump into them, and they don't always make space for you. And also, not all wheelchairs are able to make the climb, because very often it can be as much as 8 inches. And that's just the tubes that are meant to be accessible, and I don't mean the ones that have got real steps, as many of the underground in London is still inaccessible because of stairs and lack of lifts. And the next picture is in Strasbourg in France, and I'm showing that because a lot of disabled people have to use that kind of transport, which is really a bad use of time, if I can say that, because you have to wait for everybody to go around the whole city when they pick you up and deposit you, etc. And we do have those also in this country, especially for things like hospital appointments and shopping for people in in daycare centers or in residential homes, etc. But does accessible always mean inclusive and non-discriminatory? No, it doesn't always on public transport, because accessibility needs maintenance. Often ramps don't work. Announcements on buses stop working. These are for blind passengers. Bus drivers refuse to stop and are abusive. Passengers can be abusive, such as, and I've met those, such as people with prams who refuse to give priority to wheelchair spaces, even though there are signs that tell you that. And abusive people with guide dogs. And so disability hate crimes happen on public transport. Passenger assistance on trains require advance notice, and often the staff don't turn up and they leave passengers stranded. How often have I read on Twitter people who are left on the train not being able to get off because they've just been forgotten. There are also lifts that stop working. All kinds of train stations, and if you don't know, you get stuck. I was stuck when I was meant to be at the television station. I was meant to be giving an interview, and I couldn't go because the lift at that particular station just stopped working, and I couldn't get out in time to reschedule or even get there. So the lift, that's extremely scary. It could leave you stranded on the underground. I've had that happen to me, and I don't know if you know London, but at like Green Park, because there are like 3 lifts to negotiate. And so it can be very stressful if you need to go somewhere. And then you have to sort of think, if any one of those lifts do not work, you're a bit stuck. And on planes, wheelchairs get lost or damaged by airlines. This is on Washington Post on this year. 50,000 wheelchairs since late 2018 was lost or damaged by airlines. Roughly 29 per day. This is according to the Washington Post. It could be dangerous. Recently, a well-known woman disability activist, Gracia Figueroa, I hope I pronounced her name right, died on October 31st from complications sustained after United Airlines damaged her wheelchair, and they didn't replace it properly until too late. And I don't know, yeah. So it could be dangerous because of what could happen to your mobility device, and I'm talking about that because in this case it is a wheelchair. Passenger assistants, plane crew, are not always given training and can make disableist or sexist remarks. I remember I was once on a plane from Strasbourg to Nice, and the person who came to get me off the plane didn't stop telling me how lucky I was that I had him to come and get me off the plane, because I was traveling on my own, and I shouldn't be traveling on my own as a woman and as a disabled person, blah, blah, blah. you're a bit hijacked in a way. I don't know what's the term, because I could be rude, but if your passage, if your travel, your journey is in the hands of the person who is being that discriminatory, is it wise? Especially when I was in a foreign so-called territory. Automobiles. I include taxis. And how often do taxi drivers refuse to take wheelchair passengers or those with guide dogs? Uber has been sued for discriminating against disabled passengers. But it's not just Uber. Black cabs are also notorious for doing that. It's very, very difficult because, you know, you often end up in a strange city and you don't know how to get from A to B, and you need taxis and they refuse to take you. So it's no surprise that disabled people are not always enthusiastic about travel. And of course, there's also bus drivers who pretend not to see you and just sort of like, you know, not look at you. Or the other thing is they can say that their ramps are not working. And sometimes they're not. I mean, in UK, they shouldn't do that. I mean, you can't complain about them. But I have been in Brussels in front of the EU building, where I had 3 buses to go back to the station to pick up the Eurostar, and all 3 buses, none of the ramps worked. So in the end, I had to get a taxi with huge difficulty. So I said I would talk about the impact of the pandemic on disabled people, disabled women in particular, because for Sisters of Frida, I helped organize a report on the disabled women's perspectives on living this independent living during the pandemic. Independent living here doesn't mean, you know, being able to do things on your own. It means having the choice and control over your life. Sisters of Frida, which is, I am a co-founder of Disabled Women's Collective. We produce a report on the impact of COVID-19 on disabled women in the UK. We asked an intersection of disabled women, including disabled mothers and women of color. We included a webinar and a series of videos. These can be accessed at the link. If you go to www.sistoffrida.org under resources. It's a huge report, so I'm not going to go talk about it specifically. But there are a few points. First of all, I should say that many disabled people remarked that the effect of the pandemic, which grabs the headlines news on being stuck at home, it's a very common phenomenon for disabled people. And many of us have asked for the possibility of working from home because of barriers, transport, but we've always been refused. So when it becomes necessary for everybody, it makes it interesting for us to see the response. However, the pandemic became, and is still, crucial to disabled women in regard to public transport, crucial for survival in terms of access to food and personal assistance. Disabled women are often responsible for grocery shopping, just as other women. And I have personal experience of this in the case of not having access to grocery shopping and personal assistance. Many people say personal assistance as carers, if you're not used to that term. This also has an economic impact. Sure, there's online shopping if you can get a slot on your supermarket and afford the prices. Many disabled women are also shielding, which means that we fear contact with people. Shielding means that you're sort of in isolation, and that includes family members and personal assistants. I had to refuse personal assistants who were going to work for me because they use public transport for my personal safety. I just use one quote here from Dr. Surabaya Kumar, and she wrote this is in the report for Sisters of Freedom, and how COVID-19 measures are impacting disabled people's rights. Last year, I became a Women's Equality Party candidate for the now postponed London Assembly elections because I want to advance equality for everyone. But as I stay indoors shielding, trying to deliver my UCL, University College of London, teaching from home, while also navigating my own health needs without the carer I'm usually depend on, I am becoming increasingly concerned that disabled people's hard-won rights are going backwards. There is research which finds women and people from BAME, that is Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds, are not listened to, understood, believed, or are dismissed when they present symptoms which results in differential and inequitable health outcomes for us. And being of intersectional identity, a disabled woman of color, means that there is recognition that I experience oppression, discrimination compared to a non-disabled white person. And I'm not sure how much discrimination a white man may face, maybe class, sexuality. So discrimination as regards to inclusive mobility. I have no need to explain the intersectional concept from Kimberly Crenshaw because I've heard several people have already done so on this conference. Let me give you an example of considerations when it comes to public transport as a disabled woman of color. I always have to give extra time. In the case of buses and trains that have problems like broken lifts or ramps, and I've already mentioned when that can happen, negative attitudinal barriers from transport staff, then I have to think about, will there be accessible toilets on my journey? Will I get stuck? And do research on the environment. As a disabled woman, I have to look at things like, is there, I think it's been mentioned just for other women, is there enough light? Will I be safe? I give it a personal example here. At one time, I went to a performance by a very good friend of mine, and it was in the evening at night. And I couldn't wait for her to finish, and I thought I'd just go home on my own. What would the problem be? I just need to take a bus and then a train, and then I can get home. However, it was near midnight. The bus ramp did not work. So I was the only woman left with the bus driver, who wasn't very happy because he had to stay with me at midnight for at least an hour, waiting to be rescued, to have to get off the ramp, the bus, to be able to catch my train home. Yeah, luckily that night there was all night tube on the Jubilee line. Anyway, and then there are possible hate crimes from the intersectional kind of point. It can be from disability. I've had it, and as I've said, from people who are hostile because, as a disabled person, you know, they resent the fact that you take up extra space, or they have to wait for you. Or race, as an East Asian, especially during the pandemic. My friend James Lee has a video, and he also spoke about that. That is on top of dealing with all the transport which is inaccessible, and then you have to worry about reactions from fellow passengers who might be very hostile, because I don't need to go on about the hostility from because of COVID-19, I'm sure. So I hope I have mentioned most of what I need to speak about. I hope that you will go and look up the reports from Sisters of Frida, because I think that they are quite useful, and I have thought of using more, but I think that it is best if you look at it yourself. It's very difficult to sort of condense it. So, nothing about us without us is a slogan that all disabled people use. And that is a banner, a flag that we fly. So, can I say, in considering inclusive mobility, please do include us in all aspects of planning, policy, employment. We have the lived experience to help inform. For example, I am on the advisory panel for TransReport app for train passenger assistance. And as a panel of disabled people, we advise on how best to develop and what kind of issues that can come out for train passengers. Thank you. Feel free to contact me, elisney@etolisney.uk or at Sisters of Frida. And I hope that this has been useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Regrettably, we do not have time for questions, and we need to move forward to the following sessions. We really appreciate your participation.
Francis, can I ask one question? Eleanor, what do you want to see us do as researchers in smart mobility going forward? What is the one thing you'd like us to do?
I think it's to give disability training to all the people who use or who are on public transport, the staff, because I think that it's not always the biggest barrier, but it's a barrier that what you can do something about, rather rather than change the platform size or heights or etc. But this is something that has been reported often, and even by quite famous people like Baroness Tanny, about how she gets left. And all this needs is just disability awareness and care from people who are on policy, who are on planning, all these kind of transport issues. And also, when it comes to planes and trains and, the legislation is there, but it doesn't always have teeth. And I can't be bothered to sue each and every one of these incidents that that cost me a lot of distress and time, because I don't have the money often to get the lawyers, and also the time and the energy to go and do something like that. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you very much. So I hope that members of the audience will be in contact with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, sorry, Francis, off you go.
Yeah, don't worry. Thank you very much, Eleanor, for your kind participation in this event.